So in this video we want to use some slides to start looking at a very simple introduction to systems and systems thinking. Why would we even want to bother with what we're calling systems and systems thinking anyway? A little bit of history, for example, if we go back to when ecology was developing as a science and we started looking at ecosystems, we started to realize that a change in a part of a system can have an influence through the entire system. So a biological example was the introduction of rabbits into Australia. And rabbits are not native to Australia, but they're very good at eating lots of the flora and not only eating farmers' crops, but a lot of the native plant species, crowding out other animal species, and they've had devastating effects at various times in particularly in Australian agricultural history. These days, systems aren't limited to just ecosystems. A lot of the material now from systems thinking started to look at mechanical systems and ways of controlling systems. So a very simple example of that is a refrigerator where you have a control mechanism called a thermostat. And as the temperature in the fridge rises, for example, the thermostat will register that and will turn on the motor to cool the fridge down. When the fridge gets to a predetermined minimum temperature, the thermostat will register that and turn the refrigerator off. So in a lot of systems, you'll find something like a leverage point or a bit that has more influence over the rest of the system than others. So, for example, in the fridge, the thermostat. When we start looking at human systems like organizations or socio-political systems, then it becomes very interesting to use systems thinking to help uncover what might be leading to or what might be generating the observed system behavior. One of the problems with human beings is that they don't always see all the influences at play. But if we look below the surface, there are structural patterns in many systems that produce the behavior of the system. So one of the good ways of looking at that is to start very, very simply with what are called loops, and we'll start looking at reinforcing loops and balancing loops and start building these up into more complex diagrams that represent patterns of behavior in various systems. Before getting into the systems, just a quick reminder of rich pictures. The notion of rich pictures came out of soft systems methodology developed by Peter Checkland, an Australian researcher. And the idea with these is we actually use images rather than just a list in some word processor to help think of all the influences at play. We're not going to talk much about rich pictures because the reading on these is very straightforward. There are plenty of examples on the web, and you do need to look at these. You could expect that a rich picture might turn up in one of our exams, and you might be asked questions about it. You might even be asked to draw one. So practicing with drawing some very simple rich pictures, such as the following one. This one here, for example, is looking at you and your learning activities and what sort of things might impact on that. Well, if you're having to do some shopping, that could have an impact on it. Doing life stuff like cooking, eating, sleeping, bathing, etc., that can have an effect on the time that you can spend on learning activities, otherwise known as studying, but learning activities is a better term. If you have to visit family or if you have to talk to family who are distant via Skype or Facebook, all of that can take time. If you're having to work to survive, to get some money to pay your bills, that too has an impact. And so does partying if you're deciding to do any of that. So all of these things can have an impact. Shopping, the amount of time you spend shopping, for example, can affect the amount of time you have for cooking, eating. Also, vice versa, the amount of time you decide to spend cooking and eating could determine the amount of time you spend shopping. How much work or how much money you have at your disposal, for example, determines what you can shop for and just how much shopping you can do. Of course, time away for work has an effect on the amount of time available for learning activities. Work might allow you some money for partying, but of course partying will affect your learning activities as well. Time with family might also lead to partying of various kinds, but you can see if you follow the arrow from family to partying back to learning activities, these two things now have an influence on the quality of and the amount of time for your learning activities. Also directly the family, if you're on family with Facebook, Skype, or directly visiting them and sitting around the dinner table with them, that too affects time. By the way, we're not saying not to keep in contact with your family, but one of the things can have a huge effect on students' quality of study time and learning activities, and the time they have available is just how much time people spend on Facebook and Instagram and other addictive apps such as those. Life stuff, etc. So there's a very simple, rich picture that might give you a chance to have a look at what are some of the key things that would be influencing your time studying. Now, let's start looking at causal loop diagrams. So you'll notice in the previous example with the rich picture, we added some arrows in, but now we want to start to think about the effect of a change in one part of a system, what changes that might cause in another part of a system. Here, let's look at a very simple system. You have your bank balance and interest earned. Now, what do these arrows mean? You know that if you're lucky enough to have a bank account that actually pays interest, the bigger the balance in the bank account, so the size of the bank balance, the more interest you earn. The smaller the bank balance, the less interest you'll earn. So there's a direct influence between bank balance, or any change in the bank balance, and the amount of interest earned. You can see that there's a plus sign there on the arrow, and from our previous videos on what these plus signs and minus signs mean, you should know what that means. It means that if we increase the bank balance, we increase the interest earned. If we decrease the bank balance, we decrease the interest earned. Similarly, as long as you don't touch your bank balance personally, the more interest you earn, the bigger your bank balance will become. The smaller the rate of interest, the smaller the rate of bank balance growth. So once again, more interest gives you a bigger bank balance. Less interest gives you a smaller bank balance, or more technically, a slower growth rate in your bank balance. Once again, it's what we call a same relationship: more interest, more bank balance; less interest, less bank balanced. So you can see we could put an S there, but we've used the plus sign. Now, what does that reinforcing mean? If we just left the money in the bank, then the interest will keep adding up, and the more interest that adds up, the bigger the bank balance gets, and that increases the amount of interest being earned. And as you earn more interest, that increases the bank balance more. And so if you were to look at a graph of the growth of your bank balance, we see what we've got a reinforcing loop here, and you might like to think of this as a virtuous circle, where over time, as long as you're not touching your bank balance and just letting the interest accrue, your bank balance will grow with that kind of pattern. So that's a reinforcing loop, and reinforcing loops may come in the form of virtuous circles, meaning good, or they may come in terms of vicious circles where something starts to snowball or increase and increases even more over time with bad effects. So the bank balance and interest example is fairly intuitively understandable. Something we've grown up with. But now let's start looking at one with some more dynamics in it. Let's suppose you're in the shower and you have a temperature setting, that is, you can turn the hot water up or down, and you have an actual temperature of the shower, And we'll see what the rest of this means in a moment. So let's suppose, for example, you get in the shower and the water is colder than you want. It might only be, say, 15 degrees, and you would like your shower temperature to be more up, like around 27 or 28, or maybe even a bit warmer. Here you can see the actual temperature and the desired temperature. So we're pointing to a gap, and the gap is determined by the difference between the actual temperature and the temperature you want it. So taking the example where the water temperature is about 18 degrees and you want it at, say, 28, that creates a gap between the two. And let's suppose you change your mind and increase your desired temperature, say, oh no, not 28, I want it at 32 degrees. That would make the gap even bigger. So the greater the desired temperature in this case, the bigger the gap, or the lower the desired temperature, the smaller the gap. So we have a same relationship here. A higher desired temperature, a bigger gap, a lower desired temperature, a smaller gap. Now the gap, of course, how big the difference is, will determine how much hot water you turn on in the shower. So you'll change your temperature setting accordingly. And once again, the bigger the gap, in this example, the higher the temperature you will set. If the gap is small, you probably won't turn the hot water on as much. As you gradually add hot water, what will happen to the actual temperature? In this example, the more hot water you add, the more you will increase the actual temperature. If you add less hot water, you won't get the same amount of actual temperature increase. So once again, we have a same relationship between the temperature setting and the actual temperature. Now notice what the actual temperature does to the gap. As the actual temperature gets higher, let's suppose the figure now has gone from 18 degrees to 25 degrees, the gap between the 25 degrees and your desired temperature of 32 is now smaller. So as we increase the actual temperature, you decrease the gap. So here we have an opposite relationship, which we indicate with the negative sign. So basically, this is what happens when we adjust the shower or the bath temperature for ourselves. If it's too cold and we want it warmer, we add more hot water. That increases the actual temperature, and that lowers the gap or the difference between the actual temperature and the desired temperature. So you eventually stabilize at a setting that you want. This type of loop is called a balancing loop. And it's a balancing loop because it reaches a point that you get closer and closer to. Notice if you started with temperatures the other way around, the temperature was 40 degrees and you only wanted, and the desired temperature was only 28, the figures would still give you the same pattern of behavior. So you might like to use an actual temperature that's much higher than the desired temperature, and to see that the same dynamics are at play in setting the temperature for your shower or bath. Notice that we've called this a balancing loop, and the way to recognize a balancing loop, one that reaches an end point and doesn't just keep growing, is that you will see an odd number of the negative arrows or the opposite arrows. In this case, we have just one of them. And here's the graph. Notice if starting on the left, if you start at a low actual temperature and the desired temperature is much higher, you'll eventually approach the desired temperature. And if you start off with a temperature that's much too high and you want it lower, you still get the same pattern of behavior in the system. It ends up approaching the desired temperature and stabilizes there, and that's what we call a balancing loop. Let's introduce one extra complication to this. Most people have had the experience of getting in the shower and it's too cold, so you turn the hot water on, so your flow of hot water increases, and then suddenly it's much too hot and you have to turn it down, and then it goes too cold again, and then you turn it up again, and it's too hot again, and then you turn it down again, it's too cold again, and you get what's called an oscillating system. Why does this happen? Well, here we get a delay. So those two parallel lines indicate a delay. So if you've got a desired temperature, that's much higher than the actual temperature, you might, and therefore you've got a big gap, you turn on the hot water too much, but the hot water still has to push the colder water out of the pipes, and you feel like it's not hot enough yet, so you turn it up a bit more, and by the time the hot water reaches you, it's too high. These delays are very significant things in systems because they cause what is called oscillation, and the pattern goes like this. Ideally, we'll eventually come down to something like the desired state of the system, in this case the desired temperature. It doesn't always do that when systems go out of control, but this would be the standard pattern. So that's quite a nice balancing loop, where even though it does take time to get the shower temperature right, you get a correct shower temperature. You finally get there after some oscillation. But now let's look at an example where the delay causes much more mischief, if you like, in the system and makes it much harder for the system to stabilize. So here we have a company that has to address an issue with its service quality. So there's a perceived service quality out there amongst the customers, and there's a desired service standard that the customers want. It could also be the one that the company wants, but let's start with the company wants a much higher service standard than that being offered. You might like to think of telcos, for example, in this case. So the higher the standard the customers want, the bigger the gap between the actual service quality and the desired service quality. Now there's a delay, as you can see labelled there. Up here, there's a delay. And the effect of this delay is that it takes a while for the service reputation to diminish. So the bigger the gap, the worse the service quality. So as the difference between the desired service standard and the actual service quality or standard, the bigger that gap is, if you like, the worse, or if you had a metric on it, the less the service reputation is. You might like to think now, as the service reputation falls, what's going to happen to the customer demand? Well, the worse the service reputation, you'd expect a lower customer demand. The higher the service reputation, you'd expect a higher customer demand. So we've got a same relationship there. So let's backtrack a little bit. Over here, we've got a big gap. The bigger this gap, as the gap gets bigger, we decrease the service reputation. We now have a same relationship, so a decreasing service reputation decreases the customer demand. And as the customer demand drops, often what may happen is that the service quality also drops because companies do other things. For example, they sometimes realise they're not making as much money, so they get rid of staff, they move customer service centres offshore, and that can annoy people. So as the customer demand drops, there will be an effort to increase the service quality. So the lower the customer demand, let's suppose the efforts, and this, by the way, is a quick aside on this, tells you that the labels we put on these quantities, and they have to be nouns, they have to be things we can measure, the labels we put on these things are very important. As the customer demand drops, the efforts to improve the service quality increase. As we improve the service quality, and it gets closer to the desired service quality, then the gap decreases. If this gap decreases, the service reputation will improve. If the service reputation improves, then the customer demand will improve. Now, what can happen as the customer demand improves? Companies can get complacent and make less effort, so the service quality can drop. We're not saying this always happens, I'm just saying that in this case, that is what could happen, and as the service quality drops, as this goes down, once again, we increase the gap and we start an oscillating pattern. Now we have a balancing loop here. We know it's a balancing loop because we have 1, 2, 3, an odd number of negative arrows, or arrows with an opposite relationship of how the effect works. And so an odd number tells it's a balancing loop. The difference in this one to the previous one is because of the delay, we will now have bigger oscillations. And sometimes these can get out of control and can be the sort of things that actually can cause companies to go broke. An important point to make here that relates to what I said about picking the correct labels on a diagram, you know that you're getting it right when it describes what is actually happening. So to do a thorough causal loop diagram, and a complicated one, can be quite a few days' work, because there can be a lot of debate about what are you going to call the quantities that you're going to put into the diagram. On the left-hand side here, we can see a reinforcing loop. Why is it a reinforcing loop? Well, you'll notice that each of the arrows has a same relationship on it. That is, the greater this one is, the greater this will be, or the less or lower this one is, the less or lower this one will be. So here we have more motivation, and more productivity leads to better sales, which leads to better income opportunities, which leads to greater staff morale, and the greater the morale, the more motivation and productivity we get. That gives us even more sales, that gives them even more income opportunities, and that increases the morale even more. Now, you and I know that the morale in companies just doesn't endlessly improve. So what's going on here? Well, right over here on the right hand side, we have the size of the market niche. That is, how many people are there, or how many companies are there out there that are going to buy your product or service. And the size of that market niche limits the number of sales. So here, as we've got these wonderfully increasing sales from our left-hand loop, but the more sales we have, the greater the degree of saturation of our market niche. So more of this means higher saturation. We've got a same relationship here. The more you saturate your market, the fewer sales you can have. So your sales are going to slow down. We've got an odd number of negative arrows here, or arrows with an opposite relationship. More of this means less of that. Less of this means more of that. That's the opposite relationship. So we have a balancing loop. Sometimes this can take a while to catch up. There's a delay. So a company might be doing really well and have sales that appear to be skyrocketing, and suddenly they flatten out, and they don't realize until they've already produced too much of their product or put on more people so they can provide even more of their service. And then they can end up in trouble. Let's have a look at what that looks like on a graph. With sales against time, here you can see your sales skyrocketing, and then suddenly they begin to flatten out because there's been that delay, and then you come to realize that you've saturated your market niche. This can be a major problem for many companies, and then so that they either have to increase the size of their niche is one way of doing this, or they come up with another product or service that goes into another niche. But those things too can have their own problems. You notice that when you borrow money off your credit card, or use your credit card to buy, you can do more spending. So the more borrowing, or the more use of your credit card, the more you can spend. The more you spend, the more a person might satisfy their expectations of how fabulous life should be. Now I've bought another new glossy shiny thing, an iPhone 10 or something like that. And so the more spending, the more a person can satisfy their expectations. And the more they do that, there's often a psychological thing, they want even more. So they can be tempted to borrow even more off their credit card. That is, use their credit card to buy things. Notice what's happening here. We have a reinforcing loop. The more spending, more satisfaction, more borrowing, more spending, more satisfaction. Don't know if you know anybody who's got into this situation, but you can see the problem with this, and out of control, this could be called a vicious circle. Let's add a bit more to it though. Of course, the more you use your credit card, the more debt you've got. The less you use your credit card, the less debt you'd have. So we've got a same relationship there. The more debt you have, the more interest payable you have. Bigger debt, more interest, smaller debt, less interest. So we have a same relationship here. Notice that the more interest payable, if you're not paying it off, that increases your debt. By the way, as a quick aside, that's a trap with often those things where you pay off interest-free, put that in air quotes, interest-free over 5 years. If you just pay off the recommended minimum, or up until recently, there was a catch where it was very difficult to catch up. I think there's been legislation to fix that, but be very careful with that type of loan. So interest payable increases the debt, and if you're not paying off all the interest, you've got another reinforcing loop there. Ooh, isn't that exciting? As long as you don't have to pay off the massive accrued debt. And of course, as interest payable increases, you might hope that that would decrease the spending. So more interest payable, the sensible person will now start to lower their spending, and if they lower their spending, they might not be satisfying their expectations as much, but if we have less of that going on, we'll hopefully have less credit card borrowing. The interesting thing is, the psychological aspect of this, from my point of view, is the more you satisfy your expectations, often then the more people increase their expectations of what they want to have or feel they should be allowed to have, what they have a right to have. And the greater the expectations, the greater temptation for credit card borrowing. You might like to look at this and say, has this ever happened to you? Or you might like to use this as a guide of how to prevent it happening from you. Interestingly, one of the things you can do here is we can trace around the arrows that follow in one direction and find that while we've got 2 reinforcing loops here, overall, now in the red arrows, we have, if we follow this around, we have a balancing loop. You would hope, and what makes it a balancing loop, ideally, is this negative arrow here. So that's decreasing spending, and the interest payable is decreasing spending, which should decrease the satisfaction of expectations and might lead somebody to get a more realistic assessment of what their expectations should be. This doesn't always happen, but you would hope that that's what might happen in many cases. If it doesn't, then we've got other things going on. And now for one final one. There are lots of these we could look at, but let's just look at this one. This part should be relatively easy to understand. What is interesting is that we've got a reinforcing loop, but you'll notice we have some opposite related arrows. So the greater the customer satisfaction, the better that is, the less overwork and time pressure there should be. And the lower that is, the less overwork and time pressure, the greater the quality of attention workers should be able to give. We have an even number of these negative arrows, so that means we have a reinforcing loop. So let's just quickly go through it. The greater the customer satisfaction, the less overwork and time pressure there is. The less of that there is, the greater or better the quality of attention. The better that is, the better the product quality. And the better the product quality, the better the customer satisfaction. Now you would think that would be straightforward and would just keep going, but we know that it doesn't. So what could be the circumstances in some cases that prevent that from just continuing? Well, we know that sometimes if things get rocking along nicely and people want to increase the share value or the return to investors, they get rid of staff, and so we might end up having a high level of customer satisfaction and therefore demand for the product or service, but now overwork increases. And as you increase overwork, you increase the stress on all a person's body systems, their posture, if they're sitting too long, or if they're lifting heavy things, doing that, plus also their psychological systems. The more stress you place on the body systems, the less responsiveness a person's body is. So it doesn't respond as well to the stress because the stress hormones themselves will reduce the responsiveness of the body to stress once it's been going on for some time. As the responsiveness of the body decreases, then guess what happens? We get a same relationship here, so the less responsiveness, we get poorer physical health or a drop in the quality of physical health. And as that happens, as that goes down, the stress on the body systems can increase even more. Now you'll notice we've got an even number of negative arrows here, so overall in this section here we have a reinforcing loop. And of course we could go back to the physical health here, and if that improves we get a better quality of attention, but by the same token we've got a same relationship here. If that decreases we have a poorer quality of attention. So we have a reinforcing loop here and a reinforcing loop here, but let's look at the whole system. If we trace the arrows around the outside, what do we get? We get a reinforcing loop that gives us a vicious circle. We've got an even number of negative arrows, and this does describe the situation in quite a lot of workplaces. People get overworked, they get stressed. As their stress goes up, their responsiveness goes down, their physical health can go down, the quality of their attention can go down. That decreases the product quality, that lowers the customer satisfaction. The company then puts pressures on to try and improve things, so the less of that there is, the more overwork and time pressure there will be, and on it goes. And eventually this just doesn't keep always getting worse and worse and worse. Either the company might fail, or enough people leave that it might fail, or they do something that completely changes the dynamics of the system. So these several ones that we've looked at should give you a good introduction into fairly simple systems and using causal loop diagrams to look at the effect of the elements of the system. A reminder of how we label them and how we think about them is important, and just a reminder that they have to be nouns or groups of words that can be considered as a noun. And these are the two references we've used for these diagrams, just so that we give proper attribution to the original source of these diagrams, or at least some of them.